What if the war that erupted in 2022 was not the beginning of the story, but the moment when a long-building conflict finally became impossible to ignore? By the time Russian forces crossed into Ukraine in February 2022, the foundations of that war had already been laid years earlier. In fact, to understand why it happened, you have to go back to the end of the Cold War, to a moment when an empire collapsed and left behind questions that were never fully resolved. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. Out of it emerged independent states, including Ukraine. That independence was not symbolic. It was confirmed by a nationwide referendum in which a large majority of Ukrainians voted to leave the Soviet system and form their own country. Internationally, Ukraine was recognized within its existing borders, including Crimea and the eastern industrial regions. Legally, the issue seemed settled. Politically and historically, it was not. For centuries before 1991, much of Ukraine had been under the control of Moscow, first through the Russian Empire, then through Soviet rule. Economic systems were integrated, military infrastructure was shared, and populations were deeply interconnected. Russian and Ukrainian languages were both widely used. Families often spanned both sides of what became an international border. Because of this, many political elites in Russia did not view Ukraine as simply another foreign country. Ukraine was seen as central to Russian history, culture, and strategic position. Losing Ukraine was not just a territorial change. It was a major shift in influence and identity. At the same time, Ukraine was not unified in its orientation. Different regions had different political preferences. Western parts of the country tended to favor closer ties with Europe. Eastern and southern regions often had stronger economic and cultural links to Russia. This internal diversity made Ukraine's path forward more complex. In the early years after independence, Ukraine tried to balance between these directions. It maintained economic ties with Russia while gradually developing relationships with Western institutions. This approach delayed confrontation, and it did not remove the underlying tension. A key moment came in 1994. Ukraine agreed to give up the nuclear weapons it had inherited after the Soviet collapse. In exchange, it received security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. These assurances were tied to respect for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and existing borders. This agreement mattered because it showed that Russia formally accepted Ukraine's territorial integrity at the time. But it also meant that Ukraine gave up its strongest form of military deterrence, relying instead on diplomatic guarantees. As the 1990s turned into the 2000s, another factor became more important: the expansion of Western institutions into Eastern Europe. Countries that had once been part of the Soviet sphere began joining NATO and the European Union. From the perspective of those countries, this was about security and economic development. From the perspective of Russia, it looked like a steady movement of Western influence closer to its borders. Ukraine became central to this issue. If Ukraine moved fully into the Western orbit, it would represent a major geopolitical shift. It would reduce Russia's influence in a region it had long considered strategically essential. This concern became more pronounced under Vladimir Putin, who came to power in 1999. His leadership focused on restoring Russian state power and influence after the instability of the 1990s. Within that framework, Ukraine was not just a neighboring country. It was a key part of what Russia saw as its sphere of influence. Tensions increased gradually, but the situation remained manageable until 2013. That year, Ukraine was preparing to sign an association agreement with the European Union. The agreement would have deepened economic and political ties with Europe. It did not involve NATO or military commitments, but it signaled a clear long-term direction. At the last moment, Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, decided not to sign the agreement. Instead, he chose to pursue closer economic relations with Russia. This decision triggered large-scale protests in Kiev. At first, they were focused on the European agreement, but they quickly expanded into something broader. Protesters were calling for political reform, an end to corruption, and a different direction for the country. The protests became known as Euromaidan. They lasted for months and grew in intensity. The government's attempts to suppress them, including the use of force, led to further escalation. By early 2014, the situation had reached a breaking point. Violent clashes resulted in dozens of deaths. Shortly after Yanukovych left Kiev and fled the country, the Ukrainian parliament voted to remove him from office and set up a new government. Inside Ukraine, many people saw this as a revolution driven by public pressure. In Russia, it was interpreted very differently. Russian leadership described it as illegitimate change of power, influenced by Western governments. This difference in interpretation was important because it shaped what happened next. Within days of Yanukovych's departure, armed personnel appeared in Crimea. They wore no official insignia, and they were organized and coordinated. They quickly took control of key infrastructure and military sites. Russia then moved openly to take control of the region. A referendum was held under conditions of military presence, and Crimea was incorporated into Russia. This marked a major shift. It was the first time since the end of the Cold War that a European country had annexed territory from another by force. It also directly contradicted the earlier assurances regarding Ukraine's borders. At the same time, unrest began to spread in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. There were genuine local factors involved. Some people in this area distrusted the new government in Kiev. Others feared changes in language policy or political direction. However, local unrest alone does not usually develop into sustained armed conflict. What changed the situation was the involvement of external support. Armed groups emerged, and they were able to hold territory and engage Ukrainian forces. Evidence accumulated over time showing that Russia provided support in the form of weapons, personnel, and coordination. The conflict in eastern Ukraine turned into a prolonged war. Ukrainian forces fought against separatist groups backed by Russia. The front line stabilized, but the fight continued. By 2015, efforts were made to stop the conflict through negotiations. These resulted in the Minsk agreements, which outlined steps toward a ceasefire and a political settlement. The agreements included provisions for withdrawing heavy weapons, restoring Ukrainian control over its borders, and granting a degree of autonomy to certain areas. However, the agreements were never fully implemented. Each side accused the other of failing to meet its obligations. Ceasefires were repeatedly violated. Political provisions remained unresolved. As a result, the conflict did not end. It became a low-intensity war that lasted for years. By the time of the full-scale invasion in 2022, more than 14,000 people had already been killed in the fighting. Despite this, the war in eastern Ukraine did not receive constant global attention. It was often described as a frozen conflict, active but contained. During this period, the border disagreement between Russia and the West also continued. NATO maintained that its expansion was based on voluntary decisions by sovereign countries. Russia argued that this expansion threatened its security. Ukraine remained caught between these positions. It was not a member of NATO, but it continued to develop closer ties with Western institutions. Another important element emerged in 2021 when Vladimir Putin published an essay on the historical relationship between Russians and Ukrainians. In this essay, he argued that the two nations were essentially one people, and that Ukraine's modern statehood was the result of historical processes, rather than a deeply rooted independent identity. This argument did not create the conflict, but it clarified a key aspect of how Russian leadership viewed Ukraine. If Ukraine was not fully separate, then its political choices could have been subject to challenge. This perspective added to the existing tensions. It suggested that the conflict was not only about security or alliances, but also about identity and legitimacy. By late 2021, the situation had become increasingly unstable. Russian military forces began to gather near Ukraine's borders in large numbers. Diplomatic efforts were made to address the situation, but they did not produce a lasting solution. In February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This marked a major escalation from the earlier conflict in the east. Russian forces attacked from multiple directions, targeting not only disputed regions, but also major cities across the country. For many observers, the scale of the invasion came as a shock. But when viewed in the context of the previous events, it was part of a longer process. The origins of the war cannot be traced to a single cause. They involve a combination of historical, political, and strategic factors. One factor is the legacy of the Soviet Union and the unresolved questions it left behind. Another is the competition over influence in Eastern Europe, including the role of NATO and the European Union. A third is Ukraine's internal political development and its efforts to define its own direction. A fourth is Russia's decision to use military force in 2014, which transformed a political dispute into an armed conflict. Finally, there is the role of leadership and ideology, particularly the view that Ukraine's independence is not fully legitimate. When these elements are considered together, the escalation of the conflict becomes easier to understand. The war is not simply about territory. It is about sovereignty, influence, and competing visions of political order. It is also about the question of who has the authority to decide the future of a country.